Welcome to the Care Smarts 360 On Air podcast, a home care podcast. I'm Mike Palladino, a senior account executive here at Care Smarts. And today we're really going to focus on how to communicate effectively with aging parents. And effective communication with elderly really requires patience, empathy, and of course, understanding. Creating a conducive environment for open dialogue, free of distractions, is also a very important aspect of such topics. Approach conversations with respect, acknowledge wisdom and autonomy while also being mindful of any hearing and cognitive impairments that might be equipping these elderly folks we're working with. Simplify your language, speak clearly, and allowing them to, process information and express themselves is really going to lead to a lot more success in managing this population. Further to that, nonverbal cues like gentle touch or eye contact can enhance connection, especially if verbal communication is, of course, challenging. Listen actively, validating their feelings and concerns, and avoid interrupting or dismissing their experiences. So from there, above all else, be patient and be adaptable. Understand that communication may evolve as their needs change and be ready to adjust your approach accordingly. Now, that said, today we have Isabel on the panel, a senior care planner who helps families navigate the complexities of caregiving by guiding them with effective strategies tailored to their unique circumstances. Welcome to the Care Smarts 360 On Air podcast, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me today. It's a great honor being here today.
Yeah, awesome. We're very excited to chat a bit more about your expertise in the industry, more specifically about this topic. And I know that the audience that's going to listen in is certainly going to learn a thing or two given your extensive knowledge and experience. So I think with that said, Isabel, we'll kick things off and we'll get down to some of the questions I know the audience is really yearning to learn more about. So the first one I'm kind of curious about is, can you share some common communication challenges that typically arise when you're interacting with aging parents or patients, and how can we effectively navigate some of those challenges?
One of the most common challenges, I believe, is that as we become the caregivers, we forget that our parents were taking care of us before we are
Yeah.
taking care of them. So we kind of forget that, and it is a complete shift of perspective. I know that mom or dad or whoever we're taking care of, like it is hard for them to age because we don't regard that as something positive. We're
Mhm.
always like, oh, if you're aging, like cover your wrinkles, cover your gray hair. Like we have all this stigma surrounding age. So we forget about that. And we forget that with age, we start having different perspectives where we become slower.
Mhm.
And we forget that. We forget that before being caregivers, we were taken care by our parents.
Mhm.
And just thinking about that and thinking about putting yourself in that situation, we also never do that. We never put ourselves into how we would like to be talked to when we are 80, 90, when we don't hear very well, when we forget things, when we how frustrating it is to not being able to walk well, that maybe if we have the beginnings of Alzheimer's or
Mhm.
whatever stage of Alzheimer's, we are kind of like we have this brain fog. So we don't put ourselves into that situation. So that is very important to consider when talking to, I think, to anybody. We need to put ourselves into that person's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a lot easier said than done too, because we always think, in practice, this is what we should be doing. But until you actually live those experiences and try to actually embody what that individual is going through, especially with the elderly population, right? It's a tough scenario because a lot of the times it's hard to see your loved one or any elderly person go through some of those struggles, and a lot of them are unforeseen too. You can't predict these things. And I think navigating those challenges and just being more empathetic. That's kind of the word I always like to say is empathy. Try to just envision what
Mhm.
they're going through because, well, as a caregiver, we might be frustrated with the actions or if they can't hear us or they don't respond to us or listen, right? We also have to recognize that there's probably a reason why that's going on, right? Like you mentioned, a lot of things that come up when you get older, maybe early onset dementia, Alzheimer's, other challenges like walking or moving or lack of hearing. These things really can have an impact on the level of care that's provided. So being empathetic and also patient, I think, are two of the largest things that we like to see amongst those that are working with the aging population. So it's really great to see that that largely is your perspective and experience on that as well.
And even for us, like, I don't know if you have any friends, when you talk about parenting, it's like, oh, now that I'm a parent, I'm understanding why my parents were the way they were.
Yeah,
So eventually we're going to understand why our parents are the way they are
yeah.
30 years later.
Mhm.
So maybe we need to start educating ourselves on how it is like to be older and to not listen very well or have all these other limitations in our
Mhm.
lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the number one thing that I would consider about that is just being reflective of what our parents went through when we were younger, like you said, right? It's, the journey of life, and not to be philosophical, but, they always say that a toddler is much like that person that is 90 years old, where you have to kind of treat them the same way. They have the similar way of being managed, right? And it's kind of the circle of life, right? Whereas when you're a baby, you need to be taken care of. Everything needs to be done for you. And that's kind of the same thing that happens with the elderly population. I have a 95-year-old grandfather myself, and he's still very well equipped, but there are just certain things that he's not able to do anymore, right? Given his age and some of the challenges he's had in his life. So just being mindful of that and recognizing that the challenges that we see they have, it's almost equally more frustrating for them because they used to be able to do these things that they no longer can. So I think that's another pretty important aspect when you think about that holistic approach to managing those that are aging.
That's right.
hmm So that's great, great perspective, and I really appreciate that insight. Now, the next question, and I know the listeners are going to like this one. What strategies or techniques can no listeners employ to foster open and respectful communication with their aging parents, especially when discussing sensitive topics like, healthcare or the financial planning side of it?
Um, so I usually like my first I focus on three main steps. The first one is understanding the other person's perspective. Um, what is exactly their perspective? Some people are very reluctant and very afraid of dying.
Mhm.
Um, so we need to understand those perspectives and where they coming from. And until we don't understand what their perspectives are, we're not going to be successful. So maybe you want to start with other topics, like what do you think about aging? What do you think about retirement?
Mhm.
Like even from a young age, like what do you think about retirement? Where would you like to live? What if something happens? Um, what do you think about your parents, even like their parents' decisions? Like what do you think about your dad or your mom making these sort of decisions? So that builds into the framework that they have, how they think and how they perceive things. And that is step number one, understanding the other person and being empathetic to what they feel and their own perspectives. The next part is making sure that you are filling the right way, that you're setting that conversation for success. Many times we get very frustrated, we get bad news, and we want to have that conversation in that precise moment. That's
Mhm.
not going to work out. If
Yeah.
you're mad, like, hey mom, I told you not to do this and not to answer to this person, and you already send money to, well, if you're angry and you come like, "Ah,"
Yeah.
like it's like, who, dude, stop it, like I
Yeah.
don't need this.
Hmm.
So we need to set ourselves in the right mood. We need to set that conversation. Maybe you want to start delineating and writing down what you want to say and what is really important. If it's sort of a negotiation, like what do you want to get out of that? And all of our conversations are negotiations. Like, hey, do you want to come to this podcast? That's a
Hmm.
negotiation. Like,
Yeah.
all the conversations, well, not all of them, but we're negotiating all the time, and we need to set what we want to get out of that conversation. If we want them to do something, to share something with us, we need to know what we want out of that conversation, especially when those are conversations that are hard for all of us. And the third part is having the conversation. And one of the things that I always recommend is to be vulnerable and put the things out there.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm really worried about this. And this just happened. Like, we just received this really bad news about you and this diagnosis. So what do you think about it?
Hmm.
I feel really sad. I feel worried, and I feel that I'm not going to be enough to provide the care that you deserve. When we put things that from our perspective and from our feelings, and we're the first ones to be brave enough to show our vulnerabilities, conversations go so smoothly, because nobody wants to be the vulnerable one that wants to show weakness first.
Mhm. I think that's such a beautiful perspective, Isabel, because when you really think about it, a lot of, difficulties in communications is just not understanding where the other person is coming from, right? So I think when you're honest, when you're open, and you are, able to express those vulnerabilities you may have as somebody who is aging, or maybe as somebody who's going to be providing care for somebody that's aging or becoming an elder, I think just being on the same page with what the main concerns are allows you to solve those challenges or solve those potential concerns, because everybody knows what's, really, on the top of your mind. And I think that, honestly, is the best piece of feedback for those that are listening in. It's open communication, being honest, being vulnerable, and allowing those that are in a position to help, like, you and us, right? Allowing us to do what we do, to suggest what we think based on your concerns is going to be the best situation for you moving forward. And I think, that's really the number one thing, is just communication, and also being empathetic and patient. Piggybacking off of the last question, these things are all, synonymous with one another, in my opinion, and they really work well together in unison. So I think, again, a really great perspective on that. And I think it's something that is a lot easier said than done most of the time, right? But
Of course.
if we can get some semblance of that, I think we're always going to be on the right track, and get there eventually. So just love that perspective.
Thank you.
The next question I wanted to ask you, Isabel, is, and this is maybe going to be an obvious one for those listening, but how important is active listening in the context of communicating with aging parents, and what tips can you offer to enhance this skill set?
um I think it's very obvious, the answer. That's
Yeah.
very important to listen what they have to say and what they want to share. And again, it's easier said than done.
Mhm.
um so one of the things is just not talking at all until they're done talking.
Yeah. I
And
think that's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think that's just the easiest way, like just letting people express absolutely everything, and letting them dump absolutely everything they're feeling and experiencing, and just stay quiet. And it is
Yeah.
very hard because we're like, but
You always want to chime in, right? I think, that is such, like you said, it's kind of an obvious answer, but it's one of those things that's a bit harder to put in practice, right? And I've always been of the mindset of applying a simple strategy, and it's something that really applies to all walks of life. It can apply to your job, it can apply to your personal conversations, it can apply to really most things, and it's the concept of active listening. I'll never forget when I used to work a job. Actually, we used to work in risk management many, many years ago now, long time now. But I got some really good advice as I started my career, and it was from the CEO of this company. And he said, Mike, you have a lot of potential, but the one thing you have to work on is active listening. And the best thing he said was, you have two ears and one mouth. You have to listen to those that are speaking to you and really understand what their problems or concerns are, because then you'll be able to provide the best solutions. And I think that advice really stuck to me, and again, it applies to most situations, even this one, right? Because if you can actively listen and really hear the concerns or hear the struggles or hear the pain that those are no that we're trying to work with are going through, then we can recommend what we think the best course of action is and really make them feel comfortable with the idea of having a caregiver, right? Because I think that's another topic, probably a separate topic, is those, thinking, oh, I don't need a caregiver, I'm okay on my own, right? It's the idea that maybe it is okay to ask for help and ask for or be supported by others, family or outside entity too, right? So I think probably a separate conversation for that topic, but I think it is all something that goes hand in hand as well.
And talking about risk management, and I'm pretty sure that you've experienced this in the past, going through the five whys. And I'm pretty sure you use that method
Mhm.
thousands of
Oh
times.
yeah.
Uh, it's like just asking questions. So why are you so afraid of asking for help?
Hmm.
And just stay quiet. You just put it out there, stay quiet, let your loved ones go through that question and think, really think, 'cause those are deep questions. You're not just asking, do you want which pastry do you want from the store? You're asking questions that require a lot of introspection and thinking about the why. But once you do it and you let them speak instead of filling that silence with words, then you're gonna get into the real whys of,
The root cause. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. It's such a difficult concept. It's one that I'm still trying to master. It's typically in a sense of being quiet, you actually learn much more by not saying anything, because some people, generally don't like that awkward silence, right? So if you're sitting there and you're just letting them speak and you don't respond, they'll just keep talking because that's just something that people naturally want to do. And that's generally in my perspective, whether it's work wise or just in a conversational setting, generally that's when you're given the most information, is when you just sit there and you actively listen and you seem interested at the same time, but you don't say too much. And I think that can definitely be applied to the concept of working with the elderly, whether they're our parents or just as caregivers working with the elders. I think, let us know what they need, right? And they have a lot of experience they likely would be able to share if they're able to, right? So I think that's a beautiful concept, and as you can tell, this is a topic that to me is really important that we have these kinds of conversations, because I saw a stat. I'm probably gonna no butcher the stat, but it's something like every day there's like 66,000 baby boomers that retire or something like that. And it's a crazy number, and that just lets us know that the more time goes on, we're getting really close to that baby boomer population wanting to age in place or needing extra care, because that's the cycle of life, right? But I think we're really going to see a pretty high rise in these kinds of things, and a lot more of a need for providers like us, and more specifically individuals like you too, right, that have such knowledge and expertise.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that for many of the baby boomers, they didn't experience what they will experience.
Mhm.
Um,
Exactly.
some of them were caregivers for aging parents, but many of them didn't. The life expectancy has grown so much that it is very scary. There is not enough infrastructure, there is not enough of anything. And it is scary
Yeah.
facing that reality when we were never prepared to care for the elder.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such an important concept, right? Is the lack of preparation. We don't know what we don't know. We're always kind of learning on the fly, and I think that's why, circling back to the earlier points we've had, it's open communication, asking questions, being vulnerable. Because if we try to pretend like we know everything, that's largely where you're going to run into some issues of compatibility or maybe not providing the best care and having positive care outcomes. That's ultimately the goal, is to give us ourselves a chance to have a positive care outcome, right? Whether it's medical or non-medical in our case. So I think, it's always going to come back to that same idea of communication is everything, and everything else kind of trickles in along the way. So again, it's such a valuable way to think about it. Isabel, two more questions for you. The second to last question is, how can adult children strike a balance between respecting their aging parents' autonomy and offering the necessary support or guidance in that decision-making process for them?
We're going back to communication.
Yeah, seems like the hot topic today.
Yeah, I think I don't even know why, but we're never really taught about building boundaries. Especially as women, it's just like whatever you need, I'm doing. And a lot of caregivers are women, so you see these kind of like we were never taught how to, like, okay, this is what I'm doing and this is what I'm not. And that goes the other way. I'm just going to do this because I think that's what you need. And maybe it's not what you need.
Mhm,
Maybe it's what you think they need. So, first of all, is having this conversation like, hey, is it okay that I help you with this? Is it okay that I do this for you? Is it okay? And how listening to what they need and what they think.
mhm.
And maybe, and then it's taking baby steps into that direction. I don't even remember who I was talking with, probably a client that um their dad had decided to give away his car keys because um he had learned of someone who in their 80s had killed someone else because their reflexes were not as good as they were as when they were younger. And when he reached that age of the 80s, he decided to give his keys away because of that. But if he hadn't lived that experience, it would have been very tough for him to give away his liberty of driving. So
Mhm.
it's just taking baby steps into and trying to explain to them why it is important and putting
Yeah.
these examples and just getting baby steps into, okay, maybe you need to give away your keys, but what if we start why don't you start asking for help when you're driving far away?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
maybe it's okay going to the store, maybe it's okay driving a few miles, but if you're driving 60 miles, maybe ask for help. And it is these kind of circumstances of making baby steps and paying attention to how the family feels. Because also when parents start relying more on us, that means that we have more things to do. And that is also not good for any caregiver because then their lives start shrinking. Instead of when you say yes to something, you say no to something else.
Mhm.
So what are you saying no to?
Yeah.
So if I'm driving dad everywhere, then I might not be spending time on taking care of my kids. Or maybe I will start neglecting my self-care. So what are you saying no to? And it's these conversations that are so important, and as a family that you need to figure out what you're doing and who is part of that equation. And as I when I work with my clients, I like I'm always telling them like, hey, who else are you inviting in your team?
Mhm.
Who else is part of this caregiving journey? Because it shouldn't just be you. And the more people you invite over, even if it's just friends going over and having a cup of coffee with your loved one, then that is time that you have to spend doing something else.
Mhm. Yeah. You know what? I think it's such a difficult conversation to have. It's the idea that when, that's a beautiful story with regards to the client or the person that you referenced about giving the keys up. That historically has been a very challenging topic because that's almost at the same time admitting that you're getting older. And that's a very, very difficult topic that many that are aging go through. And I'll just use personal experience. My grandfather, when he turned 85, which is now looking back about 10 years ago, very reluctant to stop driving. And we've all seen the stories of the elderly behind the wheel, reaction times are lower, and they either cause an accident or they don't have the best vision, or no, just something, it just goes wrong. And it really can be a danger of somebody that is no elder. Not to say they can't drive, but there is just those inherent risks with that. And the idea that somebody was self-aware enough to give up their keys and recognize, I don't want to be a harm to somebody else, is, I think, very, very important, and something that we hope can be communicated to those in a productive way. Because at the same time, you don't want them to take that in a negative sense to make them feel incapable to, right? Because that's another way to really rustle some feathers, if you will. But I think it's one of those things that's tough to navigate. But again, I think having the open communication, again, is the best way to reason with the individual in that particular situation. All right. So, Isabel, I have one final question for you, and then we'll let you get back on with your day. The last one is, could you provide any insights into the role of technology in communication with aging parents and how the listeners today can leverage it to effectively maintain connection and support with their older loved ones?
It is funny that you mentioned that because um, I have my own podcast, and what's its name? And I was recording a podcast this morning about technology and the importance of technology this morning. So, um, and and I just find it funny because the name of this business is my CareLink 360. So
Wow.
it is, yeah, it is just hilarious. I'm laughing at this, like today I had this conversation in the morning. And CareSmart and CareLink 360, both of them. So I find it very, very interesting. So um I think technology is amazing today and how we can connect with each other. Many of us have moved and relocated to other states, other countries, and we just live far away from our loved ones. And I think technology brings us together again.
Mhm.
There are tons of technology out there. I just mentioned one. You can go check it out. Uh, but there are like many companies out there making sure that elders are able to communicate in an easy way.
Mhm.
And there is a huge shock in terms of technology that like the younger generations are getting used to smartphones and Gen Z Gensers are like they were born with a phone in their
Yeah,
hands.
literally.
So it's easier for them to go through these process. And like talking with my mom, she was not even allowed to touch the whatever music instrument, well, not music instrument, the music device that they had, because it was so expensive. And
Yeah.
so she tells this story that she as a kid was not allowed to play music. She would have to ask her mom or her dad to put whatever music that she wanted to listen, and obviously there was just one device for the whole family. So
Yeah, just crazy times, so different, right? And I think that's an interesting perspective too, because that alludes to the same topic of conversation of just how things are different now and how there really wasn't a way that we could have prepared for the situation and the current times that which, the aging population is generally, I wouldn't even say they're adverse to technology. They just aren't as well equipped with understanding it because even, our generation, the millennials, the Gen Zers specifically they grew up with phones in their hands, like you said. But I had my first cell phone probably when I was like 15 or 16, and that was many years ago now, obviously. But I feel like we kind of had that transitionary period where we went from not having these crazy technologies to then seeing the initial start of them to then understanding the growth of technology, right? I'm a pretty big tech guy now, so I really do try to understand all the different ins and outs. But I feel like the new generation that's coming up, again, they're going to have an even more advanced understanding of different technologies that by the time we're at the stage of, aging in place, if you will, who knows what it's going to look like? It might even be something we have never even seen before, can't even grasp the concept of, right? So that's, the difficulties that we see by generation of how technological advancements will hopefully and generally make things easier, but it's the learning curve of how do we use this thing to make it more easy for those that are older or elderly staying at home or needing care, right? Because hopefully technology gets even better to make it even easier for us to do our jobs. But I think that it's that whole idea of we don't know what we don't know, right? And that is largely related to technology and the advancements that come with it.
And it is important to know that the growing population is getting more isolated as they grow older.
Yeah.
So maybe you can remember when you were a teenager, you had like this huge amount of friends, and you would
Yeah.
go out and you had a full baseball team to play with
Yep.
just out of friends.
Mhm.
And as we grow older, with those friends start like moving away and going somewhere else, or we just lose track of them over time. And especially after COVID and after
Yeah.
being isolated for a year, now we have to go out. And it's been really, really tough for the older generations because they just went into an isolating mode, and now going out is really hard for them. So
Yeah.
we need to understand that, and technology is a great way because they don't have to do absolutely anything. If you get a really good device designed for elders in which they don't have to figure out how to turn on a phone and how to use it when they're like 300 and in a tiny screen, you can have a huge screen and just go through it and then stay connected with the people that they love. So it is very, very important that we offer them the right tools.
Yeah.
And the right tools are not the same that you and I or someone else needs. They are the right tools for them, the tools that they understand. And I think a lot of people get really frustrated because they buy the iPad, the computer, the phone, and you're giving that technology. But if they don't understand how to use it, then what's the purpose of it?
Yeah. Well, exactly. And I think that is definitely a challenge we're going to start to see is almost, it's the idea of having too much technology at our disposal. There's so many fancy devices nowadays. Which one's the best for me? Which one works for me? What, like you said, what works for me and you may not work for somebody else. So it's really, again, going back to the main point of what we've been talking about is that open communication and just listening to them and saying, what do you need? What makes you feel comfortable? What can I do better? And I think those questions, if you can feel comfortable enough to ask them, I think that's again where we see a lot of those more positive care outcomes that we're all, striving for.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, Isabel, I think your insights have been fantastic, and I want to thank you for sharing these great insights. I'm really, sure the audience got to learn some deep insights here about communicating effectively with aging parents. And, to you, my wonderful audience, thank you for tuning in. Until the next episode, this is Mike signing off for the day. And again, thank you to Isabel greatly for your time, your attention, and for hopefully piquing some interest of those that are tuning in.
Thank you so much, Mike.